my father worked in a building next door. And as a little boy, I'd meet him sometimes. In those days, children could ride the subways in New York. At 7 or 8, I would take the subway to New York, to Manhattan. You could tell where I'm from. I would take the subway to Manhattan. I'd meet my dad here, and he'd walk me around. He'd look at the Rockettes and things like that. So it's always a nice thrill for me to be here. I'm going to talk to you about space and knowledge. I've been studying knowledge for about 25 years. And when I first started studying this subject, we thought knowledge had certain psychological attributes, philosophical attributes, economic attributes, this and that. And I've written a lot about that. None of us thought much about space, which I've come to see is an enormously important attribute of knowledge. It took me years to figure this out. My friends in Japan knew this. The Japanese know something. Some things they could use some advice about, gender equality for one, but they certainly knew about knowledge and space. They had a whole word. It's a word in Japanese spelled B-A-A, ba, some of you may know this, which means the space where common context and meaning is developed. The space where common context and meaning is developed. And when I first got to know Japanese writers and people in the knowledge world, I said, man, that's really interesting and important. And they use that word every day in common parlance. We don't use it at all, and we should. There's no one word for it. That's what I'd like to talk to you about in this brief time. I'll try to leave enough space for questions. One of my heroes is William James, and he said, you never know what you're thinking till you see what you've said. So if those of you are interested in knowing what you're thinking, ask a question, you'll see what you're thinking. It's a good way to think about it. Let me start with a few stories or little parables, and then get you to think about this. A number of years ago, the Novartis company, one of the world's biggest drug companies, was looking for a home for its international R&D unit. And they decided the United States. Needless to say, every governor in the United States, 10,000 jobs, which is what it would be. And they were like a hungry dog, said, we have a steak for you. They all were, no taxes for 700,000 years, slaves, whatever you want. Come to our state. And I was involved in Novartis at the time as a consultant. And lo and behold, some of you probably know this, they picked the most expensive real estate you could find. Novartis's headquarters is on Massachusetts Avenue between MIT and Harvard, right on Mass. The old Necco Candy building. I live in the Boston area. And Novartis is a Swiss firm. The Swiss love money. They do not spend it foolishly. They picked a place that was not only was the real estate remarkably expensive, that taxed unto death. Why did they do that? Why would they choose? They could have gone to North Dakota. They could become governor. They would have owned the state. Why would Swiss people pick Cambridge? Think about that. Novartis afterwards, some of you know this, I think, they had 18 very ugly buildings in Basel, Switzerland, 19th century industrial buildings. And slowly they've been taking down building after building and putting up new buildings based on knowledge principles. Frank Duffy was involved in this. I was involved in this. Knowledge principles. So here's a firm run by the Swiss, very scientifically based, who really believe in the relationship in knowledge and space. Why did they pick Cambridge? Because knowledge is in the air. That's the answer they give. Knowledge is, that's a great economist named Marshall wrote about this years ago. He said, why do organizations, Alfred Marshall, he was the Samuelson before there was a Samuelson, if you know about economics. He said, why do industries cluster? So why did Novartis want to be between Harvard and MIT? Obviously, the professors there do work in Novartis. But there are something like 35 other drug, genomic medicine type of firms within spitting distance of that building. So you say, well, do they have alliances with those firms? Maybe yes, maybe no. Are they, they have networks with those firms? Yeah, somewhat. But knowledge is in the air. People want to work there. The people who work there talk to other people who work there. Very, very interesting thing. There's a wonderful book, some of you I'm sure have read this, by Annalise Saxenian called Regional Advantage, which is sort of the same thing. She said, why did Route 128, which is a road that circles Boston, and had many high-tech pioneer firms in it, Wang, DEC, Prime, etc., why did it fail while Silicon Valley flourished? Annalise Saxenian, much to my delight, is an economic space philosopher, you might say, at Berkeley. And she said, well, one reason Silicon Valley flourished is the weather. People go out there and they sit outside and exchange knowledge. They talk about ideas. Also, the culture of the West Coast is quite friendly. You should notice this, quite valuable. People talk, they sit around, they're friendly. I've lived for 37 years within Route 128. No one's friendly. Everyone's uptight. They're like this. My daughter, who now lives in LA, said, Dad, you know, every time I walk, I say good morning to people, and people look at me like there's something wrong with me, and it's true. It's just not friendly here. It just isn't. People don't talk. They don't sit out in cafes. The weather doesn't allow for it. And if they did sit out and someone came up to chat with them, they think it was a beggar or a con man or something like that. It's a different world. And she said this accounted for the knowledge flowing in 128. Ideas move around. They're in the air. They circulate. Someone says something to someone. You build new networks. You talk to people. Never happened in 128. 128 is dead. All those firms are dead. Silicon Valley thrives. Pretty interesting answer. Both in the United States, same taxes, same technology. Pretty interesting subject. Pretty interesting subject about space and knowledge. Oh, damn, I no longer... Here's the best advice I'm going to give you. Don't get older. There's nothing in it. Trust me. I put on glasses. I used to be able to read this stuff. Here's another question for you. Why are the planes full? I travel all the time. I try to travel less as I get a little older, but some of you travel all the time. I know that. The planes are full. Everyone's in the planes. Why is this so? A number of years ago, when I knew Dan Rasmus in Boston, I was at Logan Airport in Boston, waiting to take the shuttle to New York City. There's a plane that leaves every hour. There's 2 planes that leave all the time, Boston, New York. Some of you, I'm sure, have taken it forever. I must have had 2 million miles on that damn shuttle. And when I first got a cell phone a while back, I was waiting for the standard 6:30 a.m. shuttle to come to New York City, and my wife called me, rather annoyed, saying, you got a call from your client, your meeting was canceled, don't get on the plane. No, thank God for cell phones. She wasn't happy being awakened then. But I did something I always wanted to do. I asked the people where they were going. I always wanted the same tired, overweight white men. And I said, I went up to 200 of them. I spent 3 hours at the airport. And I looked pretty harmless. I looked just like those men, frankly. And I said, I know where you're going. You're going to New York, right? Yeah. Are you going to see why are you doing this? Why are you going to New York? And yeah, it's early in the morning, but if you put a mic in front of someone, you look them in the eye, they'll answer your question. They will. Some of them even knew who I was. And they said, oh, I have a meeting. Not surprisingly. A lot of these were internal meetings. Maybe 60% were meetings of their own firm. I said, don't you have video equipment? Don't you have ways to mitigate? That flight then. The ticket was about $500 or $600. You got to take a cab. Your blood pressure goes up just taking that damn plane. Coming to New York, you did a disgusting cab ride. It's filthy. You're tired when you get home. It's about $1,000 and it's a shitty day. Why are you doing this? I know. This is the voice of experience talking to you. Why are you doing this? And it was interesting. He said, well, there's a meeting. I said, were you told you had to be there? I said, no, not really. This is about 40% down. So you just felt you had to be there, though you weren't told you had to be there? He said, yeah. What is it? Why did you go? And I kept pushing at it. And one guy gave me the best answer I ever heard. This is for those of you who are hearing, you're culturally impaired. I'm from here. And this guy said to me, he says, you're from New York, right? And I said, right. He said, you ever play hide and go seek? Yeah, sure. What are you asking me? Yeah. Remember there was one kid who was always it? Right, yeah. He said, if you don't go to the meeting, you're it. And those of you who don't understand this, you can figure it out, figure out the context. People feel they have to be there or something will happen to them. They'll miss the signals. They'll miss the context. They'll miss the energy. They'll miss the knowledge writ large. We're not talking about knowledge in an article on biotechnology. We're talking about the great world of knowledge, cultural knowledge, signals, everything you need to get by in life. You miss it when you're not there. There's no substitute for being there. I know some of you are going to hate hearing this, and we could argue this till the cows come home, but it's nonetheless true. There is no substitute for being there. Why are we here? I don't mind coming to New York today. I had other meetings, stuff to do. I teach here. But if I said to my friends at this conference, WorkTech, can I do this via video technology? There's wonderful stuff out there. You mentioned Cisco, all these wonderful tools that are out. They'd say, no, you have to be there. We're not going to pay you. We're not going to put you on the program unless you're there. Why is that so? Ask yourself, why did I have to be here live? I fly all over the goddamn, I just got something. Please come to Sydney. I don't want to, I've been to Sydney. I don't want to go to Sydney. Can't we do this in another way? No. Ask yourself that question. Look at the delta between being there and not being there. What's missing? Analyze it. Think about it. And you'll understand the relationship between knowledge and space. Think about that. Why do you have to be there? I mean, it's amazing to me. Tell a story about IBM, a firm I love to tell stories about. They have, for all their workers, or 99% of their workers, e-learning. E-learning was invented by technologists and accountants. There's nothing in learning theory that works for it. It's mostly bullshit to save money. But they give this to their workers. The executives at IBM go to classes at Wharton and Harvard. Classes, they sit there, they meet the professors, they talk, they have discourse. When I mentioned to them, I was an executive there, when I mentioned to them, I said, don't you see the disparity? Learning is learning. Whether it's a worker or an executive, it's still learning. If you want to learn something, you need to learn it. There's emotion, there's involvement, there's presence. They didn't buy it. They just didn't believe it. It's a class difference. It had nothing to do with learning. Interesting stuff when you look at the huge controversy going on about private universities and e-learning. I myself have just been fighting at Columbia about some of this, but think about what you remember about grade school or high school, if you can remember anything about it, which is, I have friends who don't. I'm going to a high school reunion recently. I found a lot of people barely remember the high school they went to. But think about what you remember. You'll remember emotions. You don't necessarily remember that Paris is the capital of France or the Pythagorean theorem or whatever it is you learned. You remember the emotion, the feelings you had about the teachers. You learn how to live by watching teachers. You learned about what it is to be an adult. That type of learning. It's pretty different. Pretty different. It can't be done on a... Let me tell you one more little thing for you to contemplate. These are thoughts for you to ruminate about. I live in a town called Lexington, Massachusetts. This is an upper middle class suburb of Boston, full of engineers, much to my disgust, professors, I can get along with them, and consultants. It's an expensive place to live in. It wasn't when I moved there, but it is now. The median house is about $600,000, $650,000. That wasn't true when I moved there, but it is now. Has more Nobel Prize winners than any but 5 countries, because they're all the professors from Harvard and MIT live there. Right next to Lexington, right? You can't even tell when you cross the divide. There's a city called Waltham, Massachusetts. Firms are there, you know. So you couldn't tell you in one rather than the other until you drive quite a ways. Same type of houses. But the median house there must be about $350,000, about half the price. Why do people pay the difference? Same town, same state. State taxes are the same. The real estate taxes are more or less the same. More or less, what's the difference? Why? Because people like to be a sense of identity, which is a very strong thing about knowledge. Another thing I've learned, it relates to place. People enact a sense of identity. It matters. It's worth a lot of money to say I live in Lexington if I'm a consultant, an engineer, a professor, than living in Waltham, which is a blue-collar sort of place. Blue-collar, middle management sort of place. No professors would live there if they had a choice. No consultants would live there if they had a choice. Identity is deeply tied up with place and with knowledge. I went to a wonderful conference on this. I can't tell you all the details. It was terrific. At the Swedish School of Economics, about identity and economics, which is a big subject. In fact, there's a very good book called Identity Economics by George Akerlof, a Nobel Prize-winning economist. People really enact an identity. If you're a consultant, if you're a writer, if you're an academic, if you're a freelance nation person, you're enacting an identity. And to do that, you have to know certain things. Space is a big part of that. I worked for McKinsey for 6 years. They wouldn't, I shouldn't say this, I can't prove this, but I would bet they wouldn't hire someone who wanted to live in Fargo. I know, maybe I'm wrong, maybe someone from McKinsey is here and they say that's not true, but unless there was Mike Porter or some Nobel Prize-winning economist, I bet I'm right. Space is a big deal. Where you're from is part of your identity, and your identity is part of what you know. These things are intimately connected. People may not believe that, and they may say distance doesn't matter. That's completely untrue. Distance matters a great deal. Space and place matters an enormous amount to one's identity, to what you know, to where you know it, and how you know new things. Don't be misled if you really want to understand what's true about how people learn and how people use knowledge. This stuff really matters. So what is it? What particularly do we know about these things? This is stuff I've been thinking about for a long time. One of the things we've learned, and if you remember nothing else, try to remember this. Knowledge is not the attribute of an individual. It's a social thing. Wittgenstein, a great philosopher, said there's no such thing as individual knowledge. There's only individual memories. He may have been right. I'm certainly far beyond my pay scale to criticize him, but I think it's true. You can remember, first girl you kissed. You can remember your grandparents. I remember my father walking me around this neighborhood. But the knowledge, the way you think about things, the categories, the way you understand things is socially derived. It's a social phenomenon. It's not individual. If that's true, and God, I certainly think it's true, then it really matters where you are. A great thinker once said, what you know is dependent on where you sit. I once had a meeting at IBM at the headquarters in Armonk. I went to a little conference room to meet this client. It was right outside Lou Gerstner, who was then head of IBM. It was outside his office, and his door was open, and he was talking to some clients, I presume, and I could hear him. I was listening in. And he said, he's sort of a husky, not a pleasant man, gruff guy, and he said, I know what goes on at IBM. And I really wanted to say, of course I didn't feel like committing suicide that day, but I wanted to say, all you know is what is in your office, which is true. He never left his office. That's the way we work on our firms. That's what you do. People stay in their offices, and all they know is their office. I have a good friend, I won't tell you his name, but he teaches economics at one of those big schools in Boston. And, he writes a quiz. Students ask him, this is in MBA land, and they ask him really interesting questions about the morality of certain business practices. How do you deal with real issues in working? And he'll write equations. All he knows is mathematics, and he's never left his class. It's called blackboard economics. We study such people. This has nothing to do with life. What you know is strongly dependent on where you sit. If you want to know something, go there. Ask yourself this question. I get asked. I try not to tell people what I do for a living, not because anyone wants my autograph, but then I have to spend 10 minutes explaining what knowledge is and this and that. It's just boring to me now. So I usually just make something up. But occasionally, my wife, who's a much more honest person than I am, would actually tell someone. So people say, what do you mean knowledge? And one of the things I tell them, well, when someone tries to understand what knowledge is, think if you've saved up for 2 years and you want to go on a trip somewhere you haven't been to, you and your partner. What would you rather do, read 5 guidebooks or talk to someone you trust who'd been there? Now, almost everyone said, well, to be honest, I'll do both, which is probably the optimal answer, which is what I would do. But if I had to pick one or the other, I'd rather talk to someone who'd been there than read the 5 Lonely Planet or type of books. I said, that's the difference between information and knowledge. And when I say that most people grasp that, because you want to speak to someone who's been there rather than written about it. There's more trust, there's more passion, there's more signals, there's cues, it's interactive. Makes a big difference. Now, it could be done with WebEx or some fancy technologies. It's true, that could be done that way. I could understand that, but I still think, now, again, maybe I'll be proven wrong. I still think we're animals. I don't have to think this. I know we're animals. And if any of you have dogs, take a look when your dog meets another dog, what do? When we want to trust a person, you've spent 2 years saving your money, and you want to know, should I really go to Tahiti or New Zealand? You have a lot of money you've spent on this. You'd want to not only listen to the person, but maybe give them a little sniff. Are they honest? Do they seem authentic? Are they trustworthy? We may not know it, and we may not put it in those graphic terms, but it's nonetheless true. And that's why the planes are also full. That's why we do this. Is this person for real? Is this person really telling the truth? There's a sense of authenticity that's deeply connected with knowledge. Knowledge is not an attribute out there. We sometimes, and I did this myself, would think of knowledge in terms of industry, in terms of information. Information is a message. Can't live without it, but it's a message. Knowledge is what you know. They're different but related things. Don't get confused. They're two different things. Data is different from information. Information is different from knowledge. And knowledge is different than judgment. These are different things. They're all useful. They're all very important. But they're different things. They need different tools to work with. They need different mental models to understand. They need different attitudes, different measures. Different measures. These are really different things. I mean, I've been studying the last few years, oddly enough, Aristotle and his concept of practical wisdom, phronesis. I took a PhD in the history of ideas 500 years ago, right on this very island that we're sitting. And I never thought it'd be useful, but it turned out to be pretty useful. Judgment is a different thing than knowledge. I've been studying this, and Aristotle knew this. Plato knew it too. If you want a wonderful, visible example of this, walk over to Wall Street. Those people had enormous knowledge of finance. People who worked in those firms. I know quite a few of them because I taught them, or I know people like that. Huge amount of knowledge of finance, but they had no judgment. They were there, or poor judgment. A man named Robert McNamara, who died a number of years ago, is the epitome of what I'm talking about. Very high IQ, deep knowledge of a number of subjects. And I once talked to him on the ferry going to Martha's Vineyard. He had a house there. And we talked about that. I said, what did you think you lacked? Why did your life turn into a tragedy? He was Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War, and it was awful. He just perpetrated a tremendous failure in American history and caused a lot of death. I said, why is your life a failure? How did this happen? He said, I focused too much on analytics, and I didn't think about judgment at all. And it got me to thinking, and of course that's true. So these are all different things. But knowledge is profoundly social, and the reason it is that most of it's tacit. Most of knowledge, if you want to learn something, well, let me give you a real example. The year I was born, I've got to keep track of the time here, which is time for questions. The year I was born, Germany and Japan had 0 GNP. Gives an idea how old I am. Within my lifetime, almost exactly, well, they're now number 3 and 4. They were number 2 and 3, but China muscled its way in. So they're now the 3rd and 4th largest economies in the world. This has many causes. It's far be it for me to spend your time telling you what caused all that. But one thing those two countries had in common was the apprentice system. You learn how to do things in both those countries, in their companies, by working with others closely. They have apprenticeships. They still do. They may not use that word all the time, but that's what it is. You learn by doing. That's how you learn things. You learn by doing things with other people. That's how children learn. That's how we learn. That's how animals learn. You learn by participation. You learn by doing. Now, I don't mean learning the quadratic equation. You could learn that from a book. I was talking to this a large organization of chemists, the American Chemical Association, I forgot what it was. There's 10,000 chemists in this room, and I said to them, if someone graduates from a big university with a Bachelor of Science in chemistry, do you consider them a chemist? And everyone sort of scratched their head, and eventually the consensus was no. You get a degree because you've absorbed a lot of information about chemistry. You swallowed those textbooks. You hit the midnight, you read and studied, and you took exams, and you get Bachelor of Science in Chemistry. What's missing? I asked them. We had a very interesting knowledge jam. I had people asking. It was an interesting thing, harvesting what people thought. And they said, what's missing is doing chemistry. To say someone was knowledgeable in chemistry, they'd have to do chemistry. Maybe, how long? Herbert Simon estimated it took about 10 to 15 years to actually know a bounded subject. And it turns out a lot of he said that 30, 40 years ago, a lot of neurophysics actually backs that up. Someone's recently asked me how many bits goes into knowledge, how much experience. People are always trying to quantify odd things. Americans love this. But in general, it does take about 10 or 15 years to prove you're really knowledgeable about a subject. Not about life itself. That's wisdom. That's a different category. Or unbounded things. But things like chemistry, music, chess. When I was a little boy here in Brooklyn, I once played a chess game with Bobby Fischer, who it did not take 15 years for him to learn chess. So sometimes God, like with Mozart, God just strikes, and someone gets tremendously knowledgeable at birth. But we don't count on that one. If it hasn't happened to you already, it's not going to happen. It takes a long time of doing something to become knowledgeable. And if someone wants to know what you know, they have to be with you in the same place. It's not enough to send them messages, to send them information. I write books too. I write a lot of books like them. But that's not, you learn something from it, but it's information. If you really want to learn chemistry, work with chemists. If you want to learn to be a management consultant, and all the better consultant firms do this, go along with the senior consultants. Watch what they do. Pick it up like sponges. Absorb it. Keep your dendrites out. And you learn this stuff. If you want to be anything, work with people who know how to do something. And that's why space is so important for knowledge. If you have people who never come to an office, they ain't going to learn anything, folks. There was a huge movement of telepresence and hoteling and all this stuff. You can get away with that if you're a transaction organization. Selling minutes, selling stuff, sort of a commodity type of organization. And you might make a lot of money doing that, God knows, so it's not all bad. But if you depend on innovation, which I would agree with Dan, if you don't, you better really think about what the Indians and the Chinese are going to do to you. If you depend on innovation, you have to have people near you, because innovation really comes from people sitting around chatting, having a drink together, meeting. You know, one of the great things Novartis did in this buildings in Basel, I think they showed people around. You could go there and see it. Every floor had an Italian coffee station. Wire-back chairs, marble tables, free espresso and biscotti. This is not only to feed you and keep your neurons flashing and give you some sugar. It's a signal. It's a signal, because the firm is paying for this. And the signal is, stop what you're doing, sit down, talk to someone about something. It's the exact opposite of we're a lean fighting machine. The exact opposite. You couldn't find two things more opposed. And yet, one of them will encourage innovation. People sit there, I'm working on this molecule, I'm doing them. Even if they're talking about their children, or Novartis, they talk a lot about Roger Federer, because his father was an executive there. So everyone follows Federer's career there. But even if you're just doing that, you're building social capital. You're bonding. You're building things that work with each other. Just as important in some ways, because knowledge, trust is a big part of knowledge. And you trust people, you talk to them. You know, you're talking about Federer, you're talking about this, talking about that. That really works. People learn to do that by being together. This is not work when you work at home. I said this in the wall when I was working for IBM. This was one of the things that gave my wife high blood pressure. Some reporter got me and asked me about what I think about working at home, which IBM was pushing for their clients. And I said, there are 2,000 executives at IBM. None of them work at home. They're all come in and talk to each other, because if they don't, they're it. And yet they're telling the clients, oh yeah, telework, work at home, you don't have to be there. I said, that's for losers. Anyone with the slightest bit of ambition, the slightest bit of wanting to learn, would never do that. Never, never, never. And they wanted to fire me. It became a big legal issue. They did. I left soon after anyway. But it's true. I said, if you show me one executive who got that job by working at home, I'll write a public retraction in the Wall Street Journal. And I did. Not one. No one gets anywhere by staying home. It's nice for the dog, nice for your children. Maybe, if you're sick or this or that, but you ain't going to get anywhere. The Chinese don't work at home. The Indians don't work at home, and they're going to eat your lunch. And you're not going to innovate. Innovation, Dorothy Leonard, a good friend of mine, wrote this book, When Sparks Fly. It's about sparks. It's about being there and talking and letting the sparks fly. There's no substitute for. There's some things in life there just aren't any substitutes for. There's all sorts of great substitutes for all sorts of things. Parts of your body, more and more, you can get, I had a friend who just had a valve of his heart replaced by a pig's valve. And it worked wonderful. I mean, it's a remarkable world we live in. Every he walks there, whenever we see him, we tell him, hoping he'd fall in love with us. But there's no substitute for being there, in spite of all that. So where do we find knowledge? Someone once asked me this question. Okay, yeah, sure, thanks. I'll end with it. Thank you. I was hoping you would do that. No, that's all right. Where do you find knowledge? Where is knowledge? It's in the air, but on a little more grounded level, it's in practices. It's in meetings like this. It's in neighborhoods. It's on the street. What's in the air, what's ethereal, is just signals. It's information. I said, we all live with information. God knows we all use it, you, me, everyone. But real knowledge is grounded. It's on the ground in some way, in practices, in communities, in neighborhoods, in water coolers, in coffee stations. People who smoke get more knowledge because they go outside and talk to the other people. It's true. There's actually a study about that. Almost no one smokes anymore, so there'll be less and less of them. But so I could needlessly go on about this quite a while, but as I said, if you want to know what you're thinking, ask a question and see what you said, and you'll learn something. So I'm going to stop talking, and we'll open it up to questions now. Thank you very much. Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So the big question that we're looking for insight from researchers on is how much time spent together in what kind of diverse group leads to the innovation and judgment that you talk about.
Well, it'd be hard to quantify, but let me introduce a concept to you and recommend the book to you about this. Cognitive diversity. You want innovation, go for cognitive diversity, not gender diversity or racial diversity. I'm not against those things, believe me, but cognitive diversity. There's a very good book by a guy named Scott Page, who's a professor at Michigan, called The Difference. And this is one of those new ideas. There aren't that many new ideas about knowledge. I said you can find a lot of it in Aristotle, and there really are. This is one of them. He said that 10 people who are diverse and have some interest in a subject will almost always, and he makes his case very well, have a better outcome than 10 people who know the same thing. Years ago, they don't do this anymore because McKinsey's picked up this message. Years ago, if you go to McKinsey and they send 10 consultants to solve your problem, they all have MBAs from Wharton and Harvard and so forth. And they couldn't solve it in 3 months after you paid their bill. They said, we need another 10 consultants. And they send the same 10 people. They look the same. They think the same. They have the same mental toolkit. That's what it is, the same damn things. I mean, someone will learn something on Wharton, the other person learns the same thing, and they come with their toolkits. you don't get it. Lawyers do the same thing. A lot of service firms did the same thing. It doesn't work. It's a scam. Not a conscious scam, but it doesn't work. What he said is send different people. You get innovation. You get better outcomes. Not random, but people who have some skin in the game, but have a different mental toolkit.
Okay.
Question.
A question in the back.
Yes.
Tell us who you are first.
My name is Bob Manikin. I'm from Baltimore, and I agree with you about the comment there is no substitute for being there. I'm concerned that maybe I agree with you because I'm in the commercial office leasing business, or that we're the same generation. My question is your position, do you think the position that you take that being there is critical is either generational, or do you think that possibly it is swimming against a tide?
No, I get asked this a lot, and it's obviously a very good question. And, you know, it's a hard question to answer, I mean, until the results are in. But let me refer you to, some of you in this room will remember this. It used to be a question, why don't CEOs use their computers? Shows you how old I am. It used to be a big deal. CEOs did, you know, I said, well, when new people become in charge of companies, they'll use their computers. It's a generational thing. But it wasn't the job of the CEO to use computers. That's not what they do. They do other things, believe me. I think it's fundamental that human beings learn in a certain way, and they don't change how they are as human beings as they age. I think this is just, no, I know. I have kids. Well, my friends have kids. I know a lot of young men, of course, they're constantly Twittering and doing various social media. That's just stuff. It's just, sorry, folks, it's just stuff. It doesn't change the real issues of learning, of knowledge, of competitive and economic advantages. It doesn't, if anything, I think it declines. But it doesn't change anything about a new idea. It doesn't change anything about deep, rich learning. I'm not talking about sending messages. Deep, rich learning. I just think that's fundamental. I'm an essentialist. I think humans are what they are.
Okay, how about one more question, and then we're going to go to break. John.
Hi, I'm John Vivadelli. I just wanted to make a comment. I don't think I agree with you on that all knowledge happens in the office. I think most knowledge happens outside the office.
Oh, I completely agree with that.
The whole idea of that hoteling or shared officing or the idea of being mobile and virtual is bad doesn't, frankly, hold water because people need to be in different places to learn different things. That's one comment. The other one is IBM, for 100,000 of their people, shared about 15 to 1 people to desks. For the next 100,000 people, they shared about 8 to 1 people to desks. And they are arguably, in this down economy, one of the preeminent companies, highest stock price in history. So,
but they don't do anything
something's
new.
not quite right.
They're like Microsoft. Nothing new happens with them. Look, Google doesn't work that way. Who would I bet on?
The Smarter Planet? I don't know.
I know it's an interesting PR concept, but I mean, it's trying. That Knowledge Jam was a very good idea, and there's smart people there. If you stay, I'm not saying all knowledge happens in the office. I completely agree with you. It happens in the field. It happens with clients. It happens on the planes. But if you go home and never tell anyone about it, if you just learn it yourself, that's what I was saying. That's just worthless. If you never meet with your colleagues, if you don't talk, so knowledge is social. You're absolutely right. It doesn't happen in the office. I completely. But if you don't go to the office, if you have no office to go to, you could tell it to your dog. I had a very smart poodle at one time. Dog died. Dog was smarter than me. And I could tell it to the dog. But if you don't talk to your colleagues, again, these firms are social entities, IBM and everyone else. And
okay, so
sorry. It's a good question, though. I mean, we could talk about that all morning, and you're right. I know, it'd be fun. I agree with you.
You guys can talk at the break about that.
I know.
And then give us a summary when you come back. That's your job, John. Okay, so we have a quick comment from...
Hi, I'm Nelson Morales from Novartis Pharmaceuticals. Thanks.
I don't know this guy.
We don't know each other. I'm hoping to get, I just want to make a quick comment. He's spot on. The site that we're doing in Basel is spot on. Cambridge. We're also in East Hanover. And I physically and personally transitioned about 2,400 people through our change management process. So we are creating this knowledge, and interaction means knowledge. But we have a little dilemma at Novartis also, because with leveraging mobility, is we're increasing that interaction, but the infinite wisdom of HR, my wife's in HR, so I hope I don't offend anyone, is this work from home, telecommuting. They're really pushing that, which contradicts everything that we're doing, so maybe a quick comment on that would be great. Thank you.
You know, been doing this work for about 25, 30 years. The HR as a subject is just gone. I never speak to them. I never get invited to do anything with HR. None of my other friends do. I think they just intellectually are vapid. I'm sorry to tell you, but I just think that's true. Compared to many other subjects, it's just they don't do much. There's no new ideas except how do we save more money? How do we cut benefits? How do we do just what you're saying? It's become a branch of accounting and not a branch of learning. It's pathetic. I have nothing I can say about that, but I don't have to make it, you know, I have enough money to retire, so I could say what I want. You just have to fight them. You know, every ideas don't win because they're right. There's not a meritocracy of ideas in the world. Not in the world, not in the workplace. Something I've certainly learned to my regret. It's not a meritocracy. Ideas are fought. There's a fight for ideas, for you, for me, for all of us, and you have to fight for them. They don't win because they're right. Maybe if you solve Fermat's last equation, it'll bubble up and the world will recognize, or you do something in science, eventually, more or less, you'll get the credit for it. Maybe yes, maybe no. Ask Rosalind Franklin about that. But if you don't, in a company where there's a lot of uncertainty, where there's really things are hard to prove mathematically, you have to fight, really. And one of the great skills, if you want to succeed in a business or in any of these things, fight for your ideas. Use rhetoric. Learn the tools of intellectual battle. That's what you have to do. Because, believe me, many people will try to ascend with various ideas that are technocentric, that are mechanistic, the idea, 19th century industrial ideas, they're still very powerful. Individualistic ideas are still very powerful. And you have to fight it off, especially if you believe in the stuff we're talking about.
So that's a great place to break. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you, Cynthia.
We will be back.